It must be great to be a genius. Things just must seem so easy and obvious. In this case, the genius is Kelly Johnson, and the aircraft he eventually would build was the P-80 Shooting Star. Lockheed had wanted to get into the jet game as early as 1939, but they'd been dissuaded by the Air Force because of the criticality of the P-38 Lightning. Nevertheless, Lockheed had done some preliminary work on a company-financed project designated L133, which had progressed to several different versions on the drawing board, culminating in the model L133-0-2, which was a canard design powered by a pair of Lockheed design L1000 turbojet engines. The Air Force wasn't particularly interested in any of these projects, so none of them ever progressed past the preliminary concept stage. Bell therefore took on responsibility for developing America's first jet fighter, flying the XP-82 in 1942. It was rubbish, being 15% slower than a frontline piston-engined fighter but with less range and maneuverability. So in May 1943, Kelly Johnson was approached by some Air Force officials who were watching a P-38 demonstration at Eglin. They wondered if he had any ideas for a viable jet fighter. Johnson went home, got a pad of paper and sketched out his design with a pen. Then he took the sketches to Lockheed management. And that's the beginning of the Shooting Star, one of the most underrated jet fighters of the Cold War. Lockheed management had the sketches tidied up and then they took them to the Air Force as the L-140. Opting for simplicity over style, Johnson and his team settled on a clean aircraft with a low aspect ratio laminar flow wing. Conventional tail surfaces and a retractable tricycle undercarriage were adopted. The engine was to be fed by air intakes positioned in the lower fuselage forward of the wing leading edge and exhausted through a straight tailpipe. The pilot sat in a pressurized cockpit underneath a rearward sliding bubble canopy. The aft fuselage with engine and tail surfaces was detachable as a single unit for ready access to the power plant. The Air Force thought that it had merit and they invited Johnson and Lockheed to Wright Field in June to present their concept. The assembled technical folks had some comments. Knowing what they knew about jets, they thought that the air intakes were too small, but that the projected performance was too conservative. The latter would prove to be correct. When it was first flown, the XP-80 was fast. One area of major disagreement was the control surfaces. The assembled technical luminaries thought that they were much too small to work effectively. Johnson knew this, but he intended to fit a hydraulic boost system to make them effective at the high speed his jet would be capable of. At the end of the meeting, Johnson promised that if the Air Force could get in the engine, then he'd fly the aircraft within 180 days. Of course, he was cheating a bit with this promise, as Lockheed had already begun preliminary work. He had also assembled the first version of his Skunk Works, an elite group of 128 people located in a rather makeshift workshop next to Lockheed's wind tunnel. This would be the team that would bring the XP-80 to life. The Air Force issued a contract for a single example of L-140 on June the 24th, and the race was on. By August, the fuselage was taking shape, with changes being made and documented as the team went. The engine was finally received on November the 2nd and was fitted up to the now largely complete aircraft. It was a Halford H-1, the engine that would later be known as the de Havilland Goblin. The specific engine was the spare for the unit that powered the de Havilland Vampire prototype. As a complete package, the XP-80 weighed 6,287 pounds empty and 8,196 pounds loaded. Wingspan was 37 feet with a wing area of 240 square feet. Fuselage length was 32 foot 10 inches and overall height 10 feet 3 inches. It was therefore substantially smaller than a Gloster Meteor F-3, which had a wingspan of 43 feet, was 41 and a bit in length, and 13 feet high. Although the Meteor's wing area was 374 square feet, it weighed as much empty as the XP-80 was loaded. Ready for flight, the Meteor weighed 13,000 pounds, although obviously it had two engines. During tests, the XP-80 reached a top speed of 502 miles an hour at 20,480 feet, becoming the first USAF aircraft to exceed 500 miles an hour in level flight. Service ceiling was 41,000 feet. Initial climb rate was 3,000 feet a minute. The first flight was scheduled for the 17th of November, but as the engine was run up, the intakes on the fuselage sides imploded. The H-1 was not, as it was sometimes reported, destroyed in this incident, but when it was torn down for inspection, cracks were discovered in the compressor vanes, which could well have led to a crash at a later point. As it was, the wait for a replacement engine lasted until December the 27th. The XP-80 took its first flight at 10 past 9 in the morning on January the 8th, 1944 at Murrock Dry Lake. It only lasted 5 minutes because the landing gear refused to retract. The powered controls also felt oversensitive to test pilot Milo Burcham, but it was a takeoff and a landing. With some fiddling about with the landing gear and reassurance that the ailerons were working correctly, Burcham tried again at 10 a.m. The landing gear retracted. He climbed, then leveled out, pushed the throttle onwards, and casually hit 490 miles an hour, faster than the top piston engine fighters of the day and with room to spare. He was, after all, flying with a derated Goblin that only offered 2,240 pounds of thrust. Just as the XP-80 was taking its first flights, Lockheed approached the Air Force with a proposal for an improved version, the XP-80A, built around the General Electric I-40 engine. In this early version, the I-40 gave 4,000 pounds of thrust. More importantly, it was actually available as licensed production of the H-1 Goblin by Alice Chambers was delayed by quality issues. Getting the I-40 into production also proved hard as GE struggled to fix design issues and then set up a line. For this reason, the engine was handed over to the Allison division, and it eventually entered service as the J-33. To accommodate the larger engine and other improvements, the XP-80A was significantly larger and about 25% heavier than the XP-80 prototype in order to accommodate the larger engine. The wingspan was 39 feet, 2 feet greater than on the XP-80, but wing area was reduced to 237.6 square feet by using a narrower chord. Length was increased from 32 foot 10 inches to 34 feet 6 inches, and the intakes were relocated a little aft to a position just below the cockpit windshield. Height increased to 11 foot 4 inches in the process. The weight grew to 7,225 pounds empty, 9,600 pounds gross, and 13,780 pounds at maximum takeoff. So the Shooting Star was now where the Meteor was in weight, if not in size. The increased weight required a stronger undercarriage, of course. Ammunition capacity increased from 200 to 300 rounds for each of the 4 guns, and internal fuel capacity increased from 285 to 485 US gallons. The XP-80A also debuted wingtip tanks. For pilot comfort and effectiveness, it was fitted with a pressurized cockpit. Once again, Kelly Johnson committed to accelerated development. The first XP-80A was to be ready in 150 days and the second in 180. As it happened, the first aircraft, known as the Grey Ghost, was ready in 132 days and took its first flight on June 10, 1944. The second aircraft, the Silver Ghost, also beat the 180-day target, but only by 3 days. A decision to install a second seat for a flight engineer to ride in meant that it took its first flight on August 1st. The Silver Ghost's main role was to test the engine and to engage in a wide range of performance tests against a P-51B Mustang. Lockheed's fighter was found to be superior in all aspects, besides initial climb rate and turning capability below 175 knots. By this point, the program was already running ahead at a wild pace. Hap Arnold had been following developments closely. As soon as it became clear that the original XP-80 was a sound design, he had started to push for serial production. A verbal contract was issued to Lockheed on March 10, 1944 for 13 YP-80A production aircraft by March 1945. One of these was pulled from the line to become the prototype for the tactical reconnaissance version. The other YP aircraft featured an enhanced engine and 6 rather than 4 guns. Johnson ignored the conservative timetable, and he had all the aircraft delivered to the Air Force before the end of December 1944. In the background, Lockheed management were anticipating wartime production of P-80s at 450 aircraft a month. Realistically, this would have likely been impossible because of ongoing issues with engine production, but there's little doubt that the firm would have got it done somehow. By April 1944, the Air Force had completed their evaluation of the XP-80 and placed a draft order for 1,000 P-80As. When it was formalized in December, it committed to a unit cost of $76,913 for the first 500 aircraft and $55,709 for the second 500. I'll get to the actual price a bit later, as the ebb and flow of the wars last year meant that procurement contracts came and went on several occasions. At one point, 3,000 P-80s were on order. On July the 26th, 1944, the XP-80 was used to evaluate the offensive potential of jet fighters against bombers. 5 B-24 Liberators were used for targets escorted by fighters. In initial experiments, 6 P-38 Lightnings were the defenders. The XP-80 tore past them and attacked the bombers, the defensive armament of which was judged completely ineffective. P-47s were tried the following day, and eventually they did score 2 hits, but only after multiple successful passes had been made on the bombers. Finally, on the last day, 6 brand new P-51D Mustangs took to the air, each flown by an experienced flight commander. Although they didn't manage to shoot the jet down, they did at least prevent it from getting a shot at the bombers. And it's worth remembering in assessing this test that this was the underpowered prototype, not a production aircraft. As preparations for mass production got underway, a YP-80 became the first of the type to crash. On October the 20th, 1944, Milo Burcham was in the third aircraft when the engine lost power on takeoff. He was killed in the subsequent crash in a North Hollywood gravel pit, a mile away from the field. As a portent of things to come, Burcham was making his first flight in the YP-80A, and apparently didn't know about the emergency fuel system backup pump for use in the event of a primary pump failure. The crash report said that the engine had a fuel pump failure and it would have been recoverable if he'd cut in the backup, which he could have done by holding down the starter button until the starter pump cut in. 500 hours of service tests with 3 YP-80s and a single P-80 lasted until November 1945 and revealed over 300 issues of varying magnitudes. Most severe was the inability of the pilot to open the canopy against the airflow. An explosive system called the Lockheed T2 canopy remover was developed and refitted to all aircraft. Another big thing to fix was the hydraulic boost. Because it ran off the engine, loss of the engine would kill the boost. Although it was possible to wrestle the aircraft in this condition, the P-80's relatively small control surfaces made this less than ideal. Hydraulic pressure loss also affected the engine fuel pump, making a restart impossible. An electric fuel pump was therefore installed as a backup. Throughout the early testing, pilots reported a disconcerting rumbling sound from the engine ducts, making them fear an engine failure was on the way. The cause was in fact high and low pressure in the duct, moving backwards and forwards as airspeed, angle of attack, and engine speed changed. Extensive testing led to the installation of boundary air splitter plates at the entrance of the duct and bleed air ducts further back. The P-80 therefore played an important research role in the development of early fighters. Hap Arnold had been a major proponent of the jet program. He was also a 5-star general, and thus tended to get his own way. News of German jet deployments interested the general, and he wondered out loud whether the new shooting star could be sent to Europe in response. Somebody foolishly asked when the general would like that deployment to happen. Now, was the obvious response. So on November the 13th, 1944, Colonel George E. Price received the go-ahead for Project Extraversion. He was to send 4 YP-80As from the service test program to Europe. Arnold's orders don't make it clear whether he intended the aircraft to see combat. I've seen suggestions that the deployment was to boost morale amongst B-17 crews who were being set upon by Me-262s, but that doesn't seem likely. Meteors were already operating in numbers by this point if such a morale booster were required. And in any case, 2 aircraft were unlikely to be seen as a deterrent by a crew cynical of publicity stunts. Irrespective, 2 aircraft were going to England in the so-called European Theatre of Operations, and 2 to Italy and the Mediterranean Theatre of Operations. The 4 YP-80As were disassembled, put in boxes, and put aboard ships as deck cargo for the journey on December the 15th. The operation to get the aircraft ready for shipping placed significant strain on the development program. There were very few spare components to be had as it was, let alone enough to support operations thousands of miles away. Other aircraft were thus cannibalized and maintenance crews reduced to skeletons stateside in order to provide enough resources for the deployment. The P-80 project was set back by months because of it. The two European theatre aircraft arrived at Burton Wood on December 30th, 1944, and were reassembled by the ground crew. The process was much harder than expected because of extremely cold weather in England that Christmas. The European deployment didn't go well. A crash on January the 28th killed one of the two pilots and destroyed an aircraft. Major Frederick Austin Borsodi went up on a test flight, climbing to about 20,000 feet. Then about 20 minutes into the flight, something went drastically wrong. The aircraft was seen to be falling like a leaf before it landed in a field and exploded. Borsodi apparently made no attempt to escape the aircraft and he was killed in the crash. Accident investigators concluded that the tailpipe flange failed in tension. This allowed enough exhaust leakage to be released into the aft section of the fuselage to melt off the tailpipe lagging, the tail surface roots and part of the fuselage aft section skin, causing the tail section to disintegrate. Since I often feel he's regarded as an extra in this tragic event, Major Borsodi initially served as a second lieutenant with the 86th Fighter Squadron, 79th Fighter Group in the Mediterranean Theatre from 1942, rising to the rank of captain, then major, and then commanding officer of the squadron up to October 1943. He flew the P-40 Warhawk, and he was credited with shooting down 3 enemy aircraft with a third share in another, completing some 130 missions. He was then sent back to the US and became the chief of fighter testing from 1943 to 1945 at Wright Field, Ohio, where he was the first man to witness and film the compressibility shockwave on an aircraft wing while power diving a P-51 Mustang up to 0.84 Mach from nearly 40,000 feet. He was aged just 28 at the time of his death. Since the P-80 lacked the range to escort B-17s from the UK, it was of zero use operationally. The remaining aircraft was therefore loaned to Rolls-Royce so that they could use it to test their new Neen engine. It was also destroyed in an accident on November 14, 1945. The Mediterranean aircraft were shipped 11 days later than the European theatre ones. They therefore likely arrived in southern Italy nearly a fortnight afterwards, but the weather was more pleasant and thus assembly was easier. Even 80 years on, what details we have of the MTO deployment are based on hearsay. There are suggestions that the intention was to intercept AR-234 jet bombers performing reconnaissance missions, but this seems unlikely given that there weren't any German jets operating over Italy until February 1945. The P-80s were based at Lesina near Foggia. Beyond that, all we know is what's stated in the official history of the 1st Fighter Group. It says that a 94th Fighter Squadron pilot called Major Lt Col flew 2 operational sorties in a YP-80A but without encountering combat. The aircraft were returned to the US. One had a long life and ended its days as a target drone. The other had a short, eventful and ultimately tragic career. It was involved in an incident in July 1945 in which a mechanical failure in flight led to an emergency landing in a cornfield. 13 days later, it was towed to a nearby highway and it was flown out. Days later, it was participating in a drone control program alongside the other P-80 from the MTO when it abruptly broke up in flight, killing Major Ira Jones. Despite the less than glorious start to their career, P-80 production was well underway by this point, and the aircraft's time was still to come. The P-80A was very similar to the YP-80A. To increase air braking on the very clean airframe, Lockheed added under-fuselage dive brakes which opened forward at the wing join, and they had a landing light installed behind a transparent fairing in the upper nose. The intake lit was moved slightly further aft and the tailplane incidence was raised by 1.5 degrees. 345 P-80As would be ultimately delivered, with several subversions appearing as the results of trials and lessons from early squadron service emerged. The first P-80A was accepted by the Air Force in February 1945. The last was delivered in December 1946. Early P-80As had a pearl grey finish which was used to seal all of the skin joints, but it proved very hard to maintain in service and it was deleted in favour of a natural metal finish. The first 345 aircraft are referred to as P-80A-1. Some of them were powered by the 3,850 pound-force GE J33 turbojet, which is the production version of the I-40. Others were powered by the Allison J33-A-9, the same engine built by the Allison division of the General Motors Corporation. I believe that those engines were interchangeable. The next 218 aircraft were P-80A-5s, and they were powered by the 4,000 pound-force Allison J33-A-17. The -5 P-80 also introduced a boundary layer control splitter plate inside the air intake. The landing light was relocated from the nose to the nose wheel landing gear strut based on operational experience. -1s were eventually retrofitted with the uprated Allison engine during routine engine overhauls. 38 -5s were completed on production line as reconnaissance aircraft, and Lockheed then converted a further 66 examples after they had been completed. Those are sufficiently interesting aircraft and different in terms of their layout that they can have their own video later. Although they were good, fast aircraft, it was discovered early on that the 6 Browning machine guns in the P-80A's nose couldn't be fired without causing damage to the structure. A stronger bulkhead therefore formed one of the key requirements for the follow-on P-80B, which incorporated 65 major improvements over the A-5. The biggest of these was supposed to be an ejection seat designed and made by Lockheed, but the seat proved troublesome and wouldn't actually be available until much later. Pilots flying the B therefore had to content themselves with the same amount of danger, but £600 more thrust provided by a new Allison J33-21 motor. Because water methanol injection was fitted to this, internal fuel capacity was reduced from 470 to 425 US gallons to make way for the alcohol tanks. Provisions were also made for the installation of JATO bottles. A dark-coloured nose fairing housed a loop antenna for an AN/ARN6 direction finding set for the first time. Otherwise, the P-80B retained the wingspan length and height of the P-80A, but it can be distinguished from the A by the relocation of the pitot tube from the nose to the vertical fin. 209 of these B-1 aircraft will be made. A handful of those and a further 31 B-5 aircraft were winterized for operations in Alaska. The modifications mainly involved canopy defrosting, but they also used uprated greases and natural rubber optimized for Arctic conditions. Incidentally, the P-80B prototype was used to set a world airspeed record in June 1947. Heavily modified, it made 623 miles an hour. The Air Force had originally intended the P-80B to be the last version of the Shooting Star. In 1947, however, funds were put aside for the P-80C, most of which were powered by a J-33 variant giving 5,400 pounds of thrust with water injection. 166 of these were ordered, followed by 98 in 1948, and then 568 P-80C-10 versions in 1949. In its final form, the F-80C was 34 foot 5 inches long. The wings remained the same as the YP-80 at 39 feet. The aircraft now weighed 8,420 pounds empty, 12,200 gross, and 16,800 at maximum takeoff. The F-80C had an ejection seat for the first time, necessitating a new canopy, the windscreen being moved forward and the sliding portion lengthened accordingly so that the canopy finished at the same point. Because I have not mentioned it before, the gun sight was a Sperry K-14 gyro unit. Performance was really good. Top speed was 594 miles an hour, the most rapid climb rate was 6,870 feet per minute, and the ceiling was a shade over 46,000 feet. Its range topped out at 825 miles for combat, but it could ferry over 1,300 at its optimum cruise speed of 439 miles an hour. The final flyaway costs of the F-80C were $93,456 per aircraft, of which $62,050 was for the aircraft, $21,192 was for the engine, $5,536 was for the electronics, and $4,678 for weapons. If you sum all of that up, it's $1.2 million in 2024 dollars. And given the extent and intensity of its service and the lessons that will be learned in operating it, the F-80C would prove a real bargain. The Shooting Star was the first jet fighter to enter widespread service in the US. It therefore suffered its fair share of accidents and incidents. In period, the aircraft thus gained a rather unfair reputation for being unreliable. At one stage, Congress even considered scaling back jet production until greater reliability was achieved. The impact that a decision like that would have had in Korea is an interesting alternate history. The facts are quite stark. Between October the 20th, 1944 and August the 8th, 1945, there were 15 accidents. Start to break it down, and things aren't as clear cut though. The next crash after Milo Bertram's death, which was down to pilot error in not knowing how to restart the engine, was a mid-air collision with a B-25. Again, this had nothing to do with the mechanical or aerodynamic performance of the P-80. Frederick Bossodi's crash in England on January the 28th, 1945 brings up one strike against the aircraft. An engine failure on March the 20th led to Tony Levere bailing out of an XP-80A and ending up in hospital, 2-2, although that was an early prototype, so it's hardly surprising. And so it goes on. A fatal crash on July the 1st was caused by pilot error. First Lieutenant Joseph Mandel attempted 3 takeoffs, crashing and hitting a parked A-26 on the 3rd. He had the flaps set at 45 degrees, which was inappropriate for the runway length and aircraft loading. Another fatal on August the 2nd, the cause of which could not be determined but led to the destruction of one of the YP-80s sent to Italy, prefaced the most famous shooting star accident. On the 6th of August, Major Richard Bong, the top US ace of the war, took off in perfect flying conditions. The takeoff seemed normal. Then during the climb-out, the P-80A suddenly went into a right bank. The canopy came off, the bank angle increased, and the aircraft went in. Bong's body was found only 50 feet from the wreck under his opened parachute. His fuel pump had failed, and he'd not selected the emergency system. From April to August 1956, there were 40 major accidents. 19 were straight-up pilot error, 4 were pilot error following a non-fatal mechanical problem, 10 were down to pure mechanical failure. The balance were 4 weather-related and 4 that were undetermined. So in other words, the P-80 was not a paragon of reliability, but neither was it inherently a widowmaker. A sizable proportion of the first batch of pilots were disdainful of the blowjets, as they refer to them, assuming that their mastery of finicky, high-performance piston engine types meant that they'd make the switch easily. Some paid for this hubris with their lives. Later experience in combat would show that the Shooting Star was a rugged and reliable aeroplane. It did, however, have performance limitations that required forethought to manage. First, its relatively low thrust-to-weight ratio and its centrifugal flow engine meant that it was slow to accelerate. This was particularly an issue on takeoff or if the pilot needed to go around on landing. Second, the P-80 was very clean and it decelerated slowly. Again, this could be an issue on landing. With planning, these features were easy to avoid, and a good number of pilots who encountered mechanical problems followed the procedures and they successfully recovered their aircraft. Overconfidence-related accidents continued throughout the P-80's career, although the overall rate did decline. This is the penalty of being a pioneer, and it's something that the Shooting Star shares with the Gloucester Meteor. By way of example, pilot error in an early P-80 nearly claimed the then Major Robin Olds. On July 4, 1946, he was flying as a wingman to Colonel John Pappy Herbst, one of the most experienced P-80 pilots, in an airshow just west of the Del Mar Fairgrounds near San Diego. The pair were in the process of making an Immelmann turn, followed by a split S prior to landing, but they started the maneuver at too low an altitude. Herbst had insufficient altitude to pull out, and he crashed in full view of the 30,000 spectators. Olds had a few feet to spare, and he survived. On the flip side, some of the mechanical issues were just comically unusual. In 3 separate incidents during October 1946, a 4-ship flight would commence a crossover maneuver at 20,000 feet. All totally normal, except that in these 3 cases, the number 4 aircraft abruptly departed controlled flight. The first pilot managed to bail out at 2,000 feet and survived. The second failed to get out and died in the crash. The third pilot fought with his aircraft for 15,000 feet, whereupon it suddenly resumed flying as if nothing had happened. Lockheed examined the aircraft and they determined that the tip tank shackles were misaligned. The angle that the well-trained number 4 pilots consistently flew in the crossover gave the exact angle required to shake the tank loose. During this maneuver, the fuel in the tank was half consumed, and the combination of the misaligned wingtip and the sloshing fuel stalled the wing. A fix was rolled out across the fleet. Other notable incidents include a P-80 flying in a formation of 18 aircraft being downed by a buzzard. One has to think that was deliberate by the buzzard. It's not as if it wouldn't have noticed 18 giant birds coming towards it. Another first fighter group pilot suffered an engine problem on approach to Eglin. Landing short of the runway, he killed 3 cows, and thus he gained revenge against nature. Engines did cause issues for the P-80A and B squadrons. Mean time between failure on the early J-33 was only 37 hours, a figure that crept upwards as ground crews became more experienced and Allison's quality control improved. Pilots also needed to improve their robustness. The P-80's speed and its tight cockpit led to many heads being bashed on the frame. Leather helmets were inadequate, so the pilots were issued with Army surplus tank helmets until a more suitable solution could be found. Having missed the war, stateside P-80 squadrons spent 2 years engaged in this kind of live testing. They also made many appearances at air shows to drum up support for investment in the post-war military cut environment. Accidents continued, but records were broken and the crowds were thrilled. P-80s were typically flown by experienced combat pilots, many of them aces. Once they learned to respect the new jets, they were able to extract awe-inspiring performance from them. Tactical exercises began appearing on the schedule as well. In January 1947, 21 shooting stars from the 1st Fighter Group flew to Masters Naval Air Station near Miami for their first major exercises. These included an interception scenario against 48 B-29s out of MacDill Field. The results of these should have been better heeded, as the B-29 force was seemingly unaware of the threat from jets when the MiG-15 appeared 3 years later over Korea. Increasing numbers of shooting stars in the inventory led to a much increased pace of exercises, and with them came yet more comical incidents that would bring a modern-day operations officer out in a cold sweat. George Davis, the future #1 saber ace in Korea, was an advocate of getting in as close as possible before pulling the trigger. On a dart shooting exercise on May 1st, 1949, he collided with the target and only just managed to nurse his damaged aircraft home. An even more remarkable incident occurred at Fort Hood. One Lieutenant Fallon dropped a pair of 100-pound practice bombs on the range and began to pull out. But one of the bombs had other ideas. It skimmed the ground, regained flight, and hit the trailing F-80 of Lieutenant Thompson on the left intake duct where it embedded itself. Fortunately, Thompson was able to return to base on one intake. The shooting star was definitely tough, but the exercises demonstrated to the Air Force that it was also a marginal CAS and strike platform. It couldn't carry much ordnance, and what it could lift it couldn't carry very far. The guns were too light for strafing, and the aircraft was deemed vulnerable to ground fire. Unless it was in the form of 100-pound bombs, of course. 4 20mm cannons were experimentally fitted to a P-80, but poor rate of fire led to the idea being rejected. While the stateside shooting star squadrons engaged in their battle with birds, livestock, and their own ordnance, their European colleagues faced a more dangerous, more complex, but equally frustrating mission. 32 P-80As were shipped to Germany in mid-1946, taking up station as part of the 55th Fighter Group, but they then returned to Langley in June 1947. The only operational US fighter group in Europe when the Berlin crisis kicked off were therefore flying antique P-47 Thunderbolts. A dozen F-80s were flown from the US in an epic series of hops, and they later joined a complete group shipped from the Panama Canal Zone on an aircraft carrier. Presumably there had been reports of an aggressive buzzard in Central America, and advanced jet fighters were there in response. F-80s in Europe were primarily tasked with tactical air support. Air-to-air missions were a secondary responsibility, with piston engine types largely preferred over the jets, which were still considered experimental. The F-80 squadrons were very busy working up in a new environment, and this was reflected in high attrition. Some of this was pilot error, but other basic problems with maintenance took their toll. For example, contaminated hydraulic fluid led to significant damage to 5 aircraft in January 1949 when their brakes all failed. Harsh German winters led to basic winterization measures being applied to European F-80s, including conversion to 100-octane fuel to aid starting. JP-1 fuel was a general problem for wings converting to jets from pistons. The JP-1 was so heavy that it wouldn't ignite from the igniter plugs in the J-33. Crews were forced to carry 100-octane fuel in the leading-edge tanks for startup and shutdown. That meant running the engine on gasoline to purge the JP-1 out of the system before shutting the engine down. Not a critical issue, but certainly an annoyance. Major exercises in the early summer of 1949 demonstrated some of the F-80's tactical capabilities, but also some of its limitations. Foremost amongst these was its inability to intercept RAF Spitfires on recon flights at 40,000 feet. B-29s remain within the Shooting Star's envelope, though, and given the emergence of the Tu-4, the fighter crews regularly practiced on them. Squadrons also rehearsed deploying to and flying from autobahns as a dispersal measure in wartime. After all this activity over nearly 5 years, the F-80's European tour ended in a matter of months in the summer of 1950. On June the 25th, North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel. A war that few in the US had predicted began as a desperate rearguard action, and the F-80 was at the center of it. Before starting to describe the F-80's extensive service in Korea, it's important to understand how the type became the dominant aircraft in Thief's inventory in the first place. In late 1944, there had been a good deal of thought about whether extraversion should be extended to include the Pacific Theatre. The High Command was aware that Imperial Japan was developing its own jet fighters, and it felt like a counter could be required. Eventually, the Air Force put a stop to the idea on the grounds that the European deployment of jets had already noticeably impacted the rate of development, and further distractions for such little tactical gain would set back jet development for some years. Plans were drafted to deploy 150 production P-80As to the Pacific in the event of the war continuing into late 1945 and 46. These plans proceeded even though Japan surrendered in August, and in March 1946, 24 aircraft plus 8 spares were dispatched to Florida Blanca Air Force Base on the Philippines, 30 miles south of Clark. They were assigned to the 67th Fighter Squadron of the 18th Fighter Group. Most of the aircraft remained parked up in storage until August, when 16 jet-qualified pilots showed up to fly them. Navigation over the large expanses of ocean and patchwork of mysterious islands proved challenging in the single-seat jets, whose pilots were very aware of their high fuel consumption versus something like a Mustang or a Lightning. In the early months of deployment, B-29s were assigned to formations for navigation assistance, but this was obviously not workable in the long run as the Superfortress was too slow. It was suggested to the Air Force that they modify some of the P-80s with a lengthened nose containing a navigator's position, but this was rejected. As I said earlier, the P-80B that replaced the A on the line came fitted with an airborne homing adapter, and some of those aircraft would also have a radio compass. A droop snoot P-80 was therefore not required. Although by the end of 1946 the group had 45 qualified jet pilots, in March 1947 their aircraft were loaded back onto a carrier at Manila and they were returned to the US. It had simply proved too hard to sustain the aircraft at the end of such a long logistical chain, given all the teething problems that were being fixed bit by bit stateside. Japan, on the other hand, was the centre of MacArthur's command in Asia. In 1948, the 3 tactical fighter groups in Japan flying Mustangs began to convert to Shooting Stars. Their first F-80As arrived at the Tachikawa Maintenance Depot in late June. The first of these reached an operational squadron on July the 6th when the 9th Fighter Interceptor Squadron's engineering officer, Lieutenant Loren Schmidt, collected an aircraft and flew it back to Misawa. Transition to the new jets was not a smooth process, as the supply chain delivered aircraft and parts in fits and starts. There were always more pilots wanting to be trained than aircraft to train in. And accidents persisted. One of the new pilots succeeded in writing off his F-80A in a high-G pullout from an inadvertently steep dive. He over-G'd the airframe to the extent that the wing skin peeled off, but he was fortunate in being able to get the badly twisted aircraft back to base. A more tragic accident occurred on June 13, 1949. 2 35th Fighter Group Mustangs bounced each other as the latter were returning to Misawa. In the resulting furball, 2 Mustangs collided and fell on the ramp, killing their pilots, destroying 12 F-80s, and severely damaging 3 more while killing 2 crew chiefs. Despite these setbacks, the supply chain eventually caught up with demand in late 1949. F-80Cs almost completely replaced F-80As in the frontline squadrons by the spring of 1950. Mustangs had been retired to service as squadron hacks and as target tugs. And then, much to everybody's surprise, the balloon went up on June the 25th and the life of training and peacetime relaxation was swept away. As South Korean forces fell back, President Truman, via MacArthur of course, ordered FIF to do whatever it could to delay the North Koreans. At 02:30 on the 26th, a pair of F-80s were ordered to fly out of Itazuke on an armed reconnaissance sortie over Busan. This was the first of 98,515 shooting star sorties over Korea. They returned without incident, refueled, and were turned around. With the light came more sorties, this time aimed at covering the Norwegian freighter that was evacuating US and other foreign nationals from Incheon and generally irritating the North Koreans. At this very early stage in the war, there was great confidence in the US about the ability of air power to win any war. Time would demonstrate this to be a false assumption when faced with a peasant army in a country basically devoid of a sophisticated industrial base. F-80s strafed convoys crossing the Incheon River on pontoon bridges. Unfortunately, their limited fuel capacity meant that an F-80 flight flying from Japan could only loiter for about 13 minutes over Seoul before it had to return. This was barely enough time to gain permission for an attack, let alone identify a convoy and execute a strike. The next day, a flight of F-80s surprised and savaged a flight of IL-10 assault aircraft, shooting down 4 of 7. First Lieutenant Robert E. Wayne downed a pair, using only 328 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Their turkey shoot was sadly curtailed by fuel shortage. Because of the limited capacity of the airfield at Itazuke to support large-scale F-80 operations, other squadrons in FIF reverted to F-51 Mustangs, which proved more than able to tackle the older Soviet types flown by the North Koreans. Detailed analysis of the shooting star service in Korea is definitely worthwhile, but to do so requires another long video, and I'll get to that another time. For the purposes of succinctness here, I'll focus on what was learned about the F-80 in the conflict. As the war started, the F-80 was the best air-to-air platform available to US forces. It was a useful 20 miles an hour faster than a Grumman Panther, climbed more than 15% faster, and it had a lower wing loading as well. The Panther's only counter was its vastly superior firepower, at least when gun gas didn't blow the nose off. Remember that the US knew next to nothing about the MiG-15 at this point, and that they had a general bias against Soviet aircraft, considering them to be substandard. In the initial phase in which the opposition in the air and on the ground was North Korean, the F-80 dominated their Soviet piston engine fighters and poorly trained pilots. Although the records have it that F-80s destroyed Lavochkin LA-7s alongside Yak-9s, in fact they only encountered the latter type. No LA-7s were actually supplied to North Korea. 8 or 9 Yak-9s were shot down by shooting star pilots. The first and only claimed LA-7 victory was on June the 27th, and it was a classic case of bouncing an unsuspecting enemy. The North Korean pilot did basically nothing to defend himself, and he bailed out over South Korean lines. The aircraft could have been a Yak-11 forward observation aircraft, but those have 2 crew on board. It's therefore more likely it was a Yak-9. Confirmed Yak-9 kills came the following day. In this case, a pair of F-80 pilots were looking for targets to strafe when they were bounced by a pair of Yaks. As was their general mistake, the North Korean pilots both started to fire far too soon and then exhibited very poor gunnery in any case. They also did what Allied pilots did when they first encountered the Me-262, and they underestimated just how much faster a jet fighter was than even the highest performing piston engine aircraft. The F-80s easily evaded the initial burst by accelerating out of range. The result was then in no doubt. Circling out wide and coming in behind the leading Yak, Lieutenant Charles Verster tracked it and fired a long burst before the North Korean pilot was even aware of his presence. The North Korean bailed out, but he never opened his chute and he was killed. The other North Korean had apparently realized that he couldn't outrun the shooting stars, and instead he turned back to attack Verster's wingman, Lieutenant Thomas. Coming in from astern, he got much too close and was carrying too much speed. Thomas broke hard and the Yak overshot. Within seconds, the tables were turned. A long burst of 50 cal shredded the Yak and the pilot bailed out. This time, the North Korean survived the descent. Verster bagged another Yak on the 19th of July. He was the number 3 in a 4-ship that surprised an equal number of Yaks. They closed within 2,000 feet before the North Koreans spotted them, and then they took evasive action, splitting into 2 pairs. Verster set his gyro gun sight and opened up at 1,000 feet, peppering the engine, cockpit, and wing route. He was rewarded with an explosion and grey smoke. The Yak crashed into a hillside as Verster took evasive action against the other pair of North Koreans. 2 more Yaks were also downed by the flight and a further 2 on July the 20th. The latter marked the end of the NKPAF as a fighting force in this phase of the conflict. For all of its flaws, the F-80C represented a total overmatch against even a relatively late World War II vintage piston-engine aircraft like the Yak-9P. It was more than 150 miles an hour faster, sufficiently manoeuvrable, and it packed enough firepower to cope with the older aircraft. That said, more experienced pilots than the North Koreans might have been able to make more of the shooting star's large size to ambush them and score early kills. In 3 of the combats, the Yaks got off the first shot but failed to make them count. The F-80 would prove resilient against 20mm flak, however, and therefore it might have still been a hard target. In all, F-80 shot down 14 enemy piston-engine fighters in air-to-air combat. After July the 20th came a long lull in the air-to-air fighting. F-80s were therefore flown as close air support aircraft and were aided in this by a new and now famous piece of equipment. Range was a known issue with the F-80 long before Korea. In 1949, Lieutenants Edward Jackson and Robert Ekman had devised a plan to add 2 additional sections to the standard wingtip drop tanks, adding 220 gallons of fuel. These gave a major range boost, but they were turned down by the High Command because of concerns over wing stress. In the desperate times of June and July 1950, this edict was reversed and production was ordered as fast as possible. They were known as Misawa tanks, and although effective, they had to be used with care. The added weight meant that they could easily break loose of the shackles that held them to the wing if the pilot had to pull Gs. This killed 2 pilots in the early weeks of the war. Furthermore, if one tank wouldn't feed and couldn't be jettisoned, then it would seriously destabilize the aircraft, as it was beyond the power of the trim controls to mitigate. The only way out of this situation was to roll back the canopy and shoot a hole in the tank with a Colt 45 pistol. Fuel feed in the F-80 was at a single point in the main tanks. If that valve was broken, then fuel couldn't flow from the wings to the engine, which meant a mission abort. Although generally reliable, the feed could be glitchy, a fact that a few pilots who didn't fancy being shot at that day did make use of. In the absence of an aerial threat and the stabilization of the UN position, the daily missions over Korea struck up a monotonous routine. One pilot described himself as a commuter. He left his family in the morning, flew into peril in Korea, and was back to see the kids and have dinner, if of course he was lucky enough to come back. Although there were as yet no MiGs to contend with, there were still many dangers. Aside from mechanical issues with the aircraft, ground fire was a constant threat, as were cables strung across valleys by the enterprising North Koreans. Double Yak killer Charles Verster was lucky to survive hitting one of these cables in the late summer of 1950. Spotting it at the last second, he managed to dip under the cable, but not by enough. 3.5 feet of the vertical tail was cut off. He managed to nurse the tough shooting star back to Itazuke. The pilot's own commitment to the cause also brought danger. More than one pilot got so low during a strafing run that he hit trees. Not everyone came back from that. The F-80 was an accurate, stable gunnery, rocketry and bombing platform, but to achieve that accuracy meant flying a straight course for at least a few seconds. It was in those moments that they were the most vulnerable. Fortunately, the shooting star proved capable of absorbing 20mm cannon and small arms fire. Even the jet engine itself proved robust. Captain John Salyards of the 7th Fighter Bomber Squadron took a hit near Yongdok in the summer of 1950. A 20mm shell caused a fire in the tailpipe. Salyards simply shut down the engine to stop the fire, then restarted it and carried on strafing the North Korean troops below. In the absence of enemy aircraft, many F-80 squadrons shifted back to the F-51 Mustang so they could take more time over the battlefield. After Incheon, though, the jet squadrons were able to move into bases on the peninsula. One immediate challenge they faced there was the extreme cold, which froze JP-1 fuel. As with other cold weather squadrons, maintainers were forced to use 140-octane petrol to start the motors before switching to JP-1 as the engine warmed up. In late October 1950, a UN F-51 pilot was suddenly bounced by a jet fighter. He took evasive action and managed to snap off some shots at the departing camera. His gun camera recorded a blurry image of a stubby, swept-wing fighter. Then in early November, a 4-ship of F-80Cs patrolling near the Yalu spotted 4 enemy aircraft crossing the river about 5,000 feet below them. The US pilots dumped their wing tanks and dove to engage. Moments later, the enemy pilots did the same, with the exception of the leader, whose tanks seemingly wouldn't come off. Hindered by the draggy tanks, the Swept-wing fighter had little performance advantage over the F-80. The US flight leader thus scored hits on his opposite number, who managed to escape back across the Yalu, trailing smoke. His fighter was captured clearly on the gun camera. It was a MiG-15, and its appearance caused significant alarm in the UN High Command. The USAF immediately elected to dispatch squadrons of Sabres to counter the threat, but they would take weeks to reach the theatre. It was therefore inevitable that more clashes between MiG-15s and shooting stars would occur. A massive furball on November the 8th demonstrated the superiority of the Soviet fighter. Such was the MiG-15's performance advantage that 2 flights of the aircraft were able to perform barrel rolls and loops in clear sight but out of reach of the F-80s before they turned to attack. When they did, it was almost a turning of the tables after what the F-80s had inflicted on North Korean Yak-9s. The MiGs were flown by hardened combat veterans. They dove in and out of the sun, going close to supersonic as they engaged and then burst through the F-80 formations. Shooting star pilots that dived to follow found that their aircraft started to encounter severe turbulence as they passed through 0.8 Mach. It was in this engagement that First Lieutenant Brown claimed one of the MiGs shot down. That didn't actually happen. Although Brown did score some hits, he was deceived by the release of the MiG's drop tanks and their impact with the ground into believing that he'd scored the first ever jet-on-jet kill. Over the course of 1951, the F-80s would score 3 kills on the MiG-15s for the cost of 14 of their number shot down. In general, though, when bounced by MiGs, F-80 pilots were generally on the defensive. The MiGs would orbit the slower fighters and then descend, using the superior weight of fire from their cannons to engage from quite long range. The F-80 wasn't defenseless, though. It turned better, and if the pilots held their nerve, they could exploit the low muzzle velocity of the MiG-15's armament to avoid fire by braking just as they saw the muzzle flashes. Lack of range and hitting power of their 50 cals meant that smart MiG pilots were able to stay well away from a riposte. With F-86s in theatre, the F-80s returned to being true fighter bombers, lugging 1,000-pound bombs for attacking deep bunkers, railway yards, and the grass strips used by PO2 nuisance raiders. Napalm, 100, 250 and 500-pound bombs and 5-inch rockets were used for close air support, alongside accurate employment of their machine guns in strafing attacks. As you can see from this photo, some of the large bombs were a little on the aged side by the time they were dropped. On these missions, the F-80s generally worked with the daring Mosquito Facts, who found and marked targets for the fast jets. As 1951 wore on, the F-80s were beginning to show signs of overuse. The lack of range and carrying capacity also acted against their retention in the theatre. Squadrons gradually began to migrate to the F-84E Thunderjet, which, although it promised much, was quite underpowered and was not initially regarded as much of an upgrade. F-86s certainly were an upgrade, and the 51st Fighter Interceptor Squadron was lucky enough to switch to the North American fighter in January 1952. Even so, the tired aircraft soldiered on nearly to the end of the war. They proved to be a rugged aircraft that could take hits and bring its pilot home. Relative simplicity and high levels of experience with the type also meant that its maintainers could turn them around and even repair significant damage in a matter of hours. F-80 squadrons often flew multiple missions per day with short turnarounds. The Shooting Star's last mission was on the 6th of May 1953, a successful attack on an airfield on the Haeju Peninsula. In all, 277 Shooting Stars were lost in operations in Korea. Of these, 113 were down by ground fire and 14 were lost to MiGs. The rest were lost in various operational accidents, of which it's likely some were actually shot down by MiGs, or at least they suffered an operational accident due to 23mm and 37mm cannon fire. Having been both a pioneer and a stalwart servant for the US aviation community, the F-80's end came very rapidly. Although some F-80As had already made their way into the reserves by 1953, the end of the Korean War and widespread availability of much more modern types meant that F-80Cs replaced these older versions from 1954. 177 of those would eventually be operated through to October 57, when the thoroughly obsolete aircraft were retired. Some were transferred to Ecuador, Colombia, Chile, Brazil, Peru, and Uruguay in the 1950s. I believe that Chile was the last to operate them, finally retiring the type as late as 1976. The F-80 was not a stellar aircraft. It was a rapidly designed and produced prototype that became an operational fighter. Even so, for maybe 5 years after the end of the Second World War, it did represent the cutting edge of jet fighter technology. Although there were many better aircraft on paper or on test flights, the F-80 was available in reasonably large numbers. And as it demonstrated against Yaks and IL-10s in the opening days of the Korean War, it was vastly superior to the generation of fighters that preceded it. But almost overnight in December 1950, relentless progress and development rendered the Shooting Star an anachronism. Whereas straight wing fighters like the Panther are celebrated, the generally superior F-80 is remembered as being crude and obsolete. That might be true, but operating from land bases close to the action and possessed of a ruggedness and ease of maintenance meant that the F-80 carried a heavy burden throughout the war. It flew 25% more sorties than Panthers, despite numbers of available aircraft waning from 1952 onwards. One way or another, the Shooting Star was an important aircraft that deserves more fame. But as it is, the two-seat T-33 trainer derivative is perhaps better known than the original. With luck, this video helps to redress that balance.